Cool. I guess we're going to start then. Hi, everybody. My name is Will Robinson. I'll be the moderator today. I'll just give some brief background about myself. We'll introduce all the other panelists, and then we're going to get into it. So why am I here? Well, I, as Jen mentioned, am a doctor of games. I studied video games for 8 years, did a PhD on mechanism design and how to make games meaningfully say things through their rules as opposed to their graphics or their text. And about 5 years ago, I joined crypto to become a forensic crypto auditor, went deep in the weeds on how crypto games are made, but also mostly how crypto financials are made. And today, I work at Alliance, a Web3 accelerator. If any of you are ever looking to start a company, I'd love to get an application at alliance.xyz so we could accelerate you. And the focus that I've had for the last year and a half in crypto and gaming has been fully on-chain games, which we'll talk about today what that means. We'll each have our own, I think, definitions, as it's a very nebulous space. And a lot of how I got into this place is because of Scott and an early game he worked on. So without further ado, why don't you introduce yourself, Scott?
Cool. Yeah, my name is Scott. I'm founder and CEO of Argus. We are a game developer, publisher. We recently raised $10 million in seed funding from Han Ventures. Previously, I was one of the co-creators of Dark Forest, which is like one of the original fully on-chain game that kind of like, I think these days define the category. Yeah, that's really kind of my whole spiel. Pass it on to Morris.
Hello, everybody. My name is Morris, and thanks for having us. My background, well, I'm currently building a fully on-chain game called Promodium. It is a primarily resource management game, similar to Factorio, but we can talk more about why we made the specific design choices to design the game in that way, which is meant to be maximizing the affordance that fully on-chain games bring around economic design and so on. Before this, I built a crypto gaming project called Critters that was on top of Minecraft. It was fairly successful until Microsoft pulled the plug on it. But that's kind of what led us into building fully on-chain games as well, on top of a couple of other affordances as well. Yep, and I'll pass it on to Neeraj.
Hi, everyone. I'm Neeraj. I'm the founder of Moonstream. And as a player, fully on-chain games excite me because these are the kinds of games that I want to play as a player. When you're playing games that aren't as extensible as fully on-chain games are supposed to be, there's always a point where you sort of hit the bottom of whatever the game is supposed to be simulating, and you have to suspend your disbelief. The really exciting thing for me about fully on-chain games is that you don't have to suspend disbelief, and you can add as much detail as you want into what's being simulated, into what the game represents. I'm the founder of Moonstream. We've deployed 3 fully on-chain games now, one of which was a pretty big success. We deployed into the Crypto Unicorns game universe. It was called Crypto Unicorns: The Dark Forest. I think they took inspiration from darkforest.eth when they named it. We're currently building a fully on-chain game called Great Worm, WYRM, and it's inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. It's an on-chain Dungeons and Dragons like role-playing setting. Right?
Great, thanks you guys. So I'm going to kick it off because I don't know if everyone in the audience knows what it means to have a fully on-chain game. I'll start off what I think a reasonable definition is, and we'll see if our panelists want to add some more color to it. So generally when we think about crypto games, I think of us as in a Web 2.5 mentality. The assets are on chain, but the logic is run on an Amazon server. The idea is similar to Coinbase, where all the assets really exist on Coinbase, but Coinbase is managing everybody's ownership of those assets, could revoke them at any time, basically is a Web 2.5 product with a lot of success. Let's not, berate Coinbase. It's an incredible product. But what happens when you move to Uniswap, right, where all of the swapping logic is on chain instead of in some server? What unlocks do we get? And so with Uniswap, we got flash loans. If anybody doesn't know how Uniswap works, essentially Uniswap credits you the resources that you've traded for, right? So I'm giving you some ETH, I get some dollars, but really the order is I get some dollars and then I give you some ETH. That's just how the logic of the contract works, which means you can use the dollars you get through some arbitrage opportunities to find the ETH you need to even pay for it. That's how we created flash loans, which was a really remarkable new primitive in finance that didn't exist until we put all of finance fully on-chain, where we no longer had counterparty risk and magic started to happen. And so the question is, what kind of magic can we get when we don't build our games such that their logic is run on a web server, but actually on the chain, where every state change is made trustlessly on-chain, and maybe even permissionlessly on-chain, meaning anybody can add to the game, modify the game. Games like this are usually for bots because they don't really care about people. There's no longer a sense of who the player is. It's just logic that can be touched. And so we frankly don't know. We don't even have PMF. We're just exploring this new space, but it's being heavily funded, as you can see by the funded people beside me. So that's why you should be exploring it too, because it's a moonshot idea. And I think we all have different reasons for pursuing why we would want to put a game fully on chain. For me, it's about organizing the labor. So different people can build on the same product, and they can all coordinate around that same product in a way that open source game design didn't work. There are no hyper successful fully open source games because they can't coordinate value capture and value creation. But as soon as you start adding tokens to smart contracts that are running logic, you unlock this whole new world of coordinating open source development on game design, and maybe end up in a world where you have thousands of unrelated developers all working on the same project. So that's what excites me. But I think you'll find different answers from different people. So I'll start with Scott. What excites you about fully on-chain games, and what do you think they are really?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I think like I've really been on these like super far end of the spectrum, right? I think like when we created Dark Forest back in 2020, this was even before crypto games was really popular in the kind of mainstream audience. The question that we really want to ask is like, this is kind of a super open-ended question of like, what happens when we build a game that is fully on-chain, right? It was really kind of like a super-ended, open-ended exploration. And what we learned from there is that making a fully on-chain games create essentially an environment where you have a game that has an open API by default. And so I think this is exactly what like Will said. It opens up a lot of really interesting emergent behavior. If any of you guys are game developers here, a lot of you guys might have, like, in the past few years, might have already heard about the terms like UGC and like how UGC strategy is like
UGC is user-generated content.
Yeah, user-generated content that is like very, very popular amongst like a lot of these game studios, and they want to have that as a feature. Fully on-chain games, to me, in a very practical sense, is UGC as first-class primitive. Instead of like having a game where you basically kind of like rely on the game developers to define on like what you can UGC on, on-chain games, fully on-chain games, more specifically, basically opens up this like very wide design space for user-generated content, such that these emergent behavior can appear in as a part of the core loop or even as a meta gameplay layer. So to give you a concrete example with Dark Forest, we see different forms of user-generated content appear in the game. When people say UGC in a traditional game, they are typically associated with a very minor kind of like gameplay creation. It could be like, I don't know, some people build like, I don't know, like a building in the game, and they call it user-generated content. With fully on-chain games, the user-generated content goes so much wider. For instance, in Dark Forest, people built their own guild system. In traditional games, the way that the guild system works would be like a game developer would create their own guild system, and like the players can only follow along in terms of like how these guilds are implemented. With fully on-chain games, you have like full power to essentially define like how even the guilds work. So in Dark Forest, there's like different forms of guild with different ways of working, and it's all governed through smart contracts. And this opens up a lot of really interesting meta gameplay kind of layer that makes the game like has like so much more kind of like essentially emergent behavior that otherwise you couldn't have with the normal kind of like Web 2/Web 2.5 game. And for us game designers, that is a really fascinating concept, because that means we have more things for the players to do once they kind of like went through the core content of the game. There's more
replayability. There's more, like the users are essentially doing the work of the game developers and kind of expanding the game universe. And so that's really kind of what I think like on-chain games is really about, is leaning towards these emergent behavior, leaning towards these user-generated content that the players are creating that goes so much more beyond than like the typical UGC that you see in a traditional game.
And what was awesome about Dark Forest is they rewarded that UGC, right? So while there were prizes for winning the game, there were also prizes for producing mods, open sourcing them, and there's a sort of provenance and proof about who made these improvements to the game, and then they can get provable rewards that show a kind of credibility and clout for having built it. That was really cool, decentralized labor there.
Yep.
Okay, Morris, you're up.
I think for fully on-chain games, well, for one, definitions-wise, it's just that the entirety of the game state and logic is computed and recorded entirely on-chain, which is, I think if you kind of look at it from an online game perspective, it's that, an online game is a game in which all of the game logic and state is computed on a server and then streamed back onto the front end. An on-chain game is something similar, except it's computed on-chain. And the most important thing there is you need to try to see how, when you adopt this architecture, what kind of experiences can you give players that is fundamentally difficult or impossible to do if it was just an online architecture or an architecture in which all the computation is done on their own local machine, which is an offline single player game. And so the reason why that's super important is because if you don't have that, then at the end of the day, you're just competing with your swaths of Web2 games, which all offer similar experiences. And if you build the same type of experience but run it on chain, it's going to be a worse experience. And if somebody's just sitting there and they just want to have fun, then they're not going to come onto your on-chain game. They're going to go play Minecraft or whatever else entertains them. And so Scott mentioned composability, which is definitely a large part to it because, in traditional games, all of the player coordination mechanisms or even content are ones that are directed directly from the game developers, and the players can't really come on and contribute stuff and have it be canonical. Whereas with on-chain games, everything, all the APIs and all the logic being open, anybody can just take any parts of that and remix whatever aspects they'd like. The other one I want to talk about, which is when you have a game that's on-chain, it automatically does become decentralized in that way. And when that's the case, then you can open up pretty interesting stuff like building a real economy within such a game, which in traditional Web2 games is actually quite difficult to do. And the experience is maybe some of you guys in the audience have tried before for any sort of Web2 games with fully real economies that are in there. The experience is not generally good. But when you have that on chain, then it becomes a lot easier to build, and the experience could be potentially 10 times better. And really leaning in on what kind of experiences can you provide to players, I think is probably the most important question to answer about building fully on-chain games, and that's the one that I'm focusing on. I'll pass it on to Neeraj.
Actually, I want to pick up on the theme of decentralization that Morris mentioned. So, a fully on-chain game, okay, the game state should be represented on-chain, but I think it's pretty important in order for a game like this to be successful. Going to Scott's point, the lines between the game developers and users are blurred. I think we should actually go to an even further extreme and say that there's no such thing as a game developer. A lot of games that you see that are being developed today, there's still someone who considers themselves responsible for the design of the game and the development of the game. And I sort of think in the long term for successful fully on-chain games, that distinction just needs to go away, and there needs to be sort of an inversion of the relationship between players and developers, where ultimately, I think the way that fully on-chain games will look, at least the ones that have a large player base, are that you have a bunch of players that sort of exist in this game world, and they allow developers to permissionlessly come and build experiences for them, and basically they vote with their transactions on which game experiences they like and which ones become canonical and which ones don't. And so for me, the really important components over here are that permissionlessness. There shouldn't be, for example, a lot of like these on-chain experiences. You see that like, okay, there's some treasury into which secondary market revenues are going and stuff like this. I think this kind of behavior eventually goes away, and also the ways that you monetize as a developer your participation in fully on-chain games is going to require like some really original and creative thought. But technologically, what's important is that the game state and the game logic are represented on-chain, and there are no preferred roles necessarily in terms of the game logic. I think this is like a really important factor, and this is something that we sort of design under the constraint of. Right?
Yeah, no rugging.
Yeah.
No admins who can change the game underneath your feet is the optimal goal. Should we get there? Now you said like the games are going to have a lot of players, but it's kind of a joke because there are not a lot of players in this space, and actually we have a serious throughput limitation. From my calculations, it's like virtually impossible to get more than 1,000 concurrent players playing fully on-chain games right now. And if you're in the games industry, you know that like a successful game is going to need more than 1,000 concurrent players to make any money. So, Scott, you're probably the most deeply technological person here. What are your thoughts or fears or hopes on scalability for fully on-chain games?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question, and I think like the key thing here is that first and foremost, blockchains are never really have been designed for games. I know there's a lot of like layer 1 or layer 2 or infrastructure companies out there that want to sell you that, hey, we are the blockchain for gaming. But if you really dig deeper, none of them really has anything on like why their blockchains are really made for games. Like any blockchains can mint NFTs. Many blockchains can mint NFTs for cheap. But if you look under the microscope, like there's nothing about those blockchain constructions that are actually designed in kind of building these high performance fully on-chain games or having more all elements of the games fully on-chain. And so at Argus, like our main business is building games. And so when we're building our own infrastructure, we're building our own layer 2 solution called the World Engine. We design everything from the ground up for essentially scaling fully on-chain games. And as a result, we can make architectural trade-offs that speeds up the performance of these like fully on-chain games. And I think blurring the line between like I would say a traditional game server with like a blockchain while maintaining all this composability and interoperability of the blockchain that you like through smart contracts. And so I think the question about like throughputs at the end of the day comes down to providing a compute environment that is compatible with the kind of like computations that you're trying to do, right? I think like the problem here is that I sometimes joke about trying to build like a crypto game on top of like the EVM feels like trying to build a computer game on top of Microsoft Excel. Sure, like Microsoft Excel is Turing complete. I don't know if you know this, Will.
I've made Pong on Microsoft Excel.
Yeah, so like you can technically build anything on like on a blockchain that is like Turing complete. However, that computing environment, that runtime, often doesn't lend itself very well to certain kind of applications. And I think computer games being like one of a great example of where a traditional blockchain runtime is actually not very compatible with, right? And so that's really kind of why we take a very radical approach at Argus in terms of like investing a lot of resources into our infrastructure. And that's really what I think is necessary for us to really push the frontier in the design space of like fully on-chain games. At the end of the day, what we're optimizing for here is to create a larger design space for game developers, right? At the grand scheme of things, like what we're doing at the fully on-chain gaming space is really kind of exploring this new blank canvas that we haven't explored before in traditional gaming. And so anything that we're doing on the infrastructure side should kind of like expand that canvas to like allow more kind of games to be built fully on-chain so that we can experiment with more features, experiment with more core game loop. And that's really kind of the entire thesis that we have at Argus.
But can you do anything besides a real turn-based strategy game?
Yeah, 100%. So I'll kind of double click on that because like the key limitation here with building a real-time strategy game, like a real-time game.
Turn-based. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So like the key limitation of building kind of a real-time game in in fully on-chain games is we don't really have the idea of like a self-executing tick rate or an idea of a game loop in the blockchain itself. And so this is like why I'm saying that the EVM itself, or like a lot of these like blockchain for games, wasn't really designed to run games because they don't have this idea of a tick rate or a game loop essentially. And so that's like one of the things that we're very focused on with World Engine is like we want to have an idea of a tick rate, we want to have the idea of a game loop, because if you see any real-time games out there, all of them have the concept of like, tick rates and game loops. And so that is the key thing that we implement in Argus World Engine, which is going to be open source next month. And like now, like everyone can build more expressive games fully on-chain, and that limits and that like expands the limits of like on-chain games beyond this like turn-based strategy game. And like I'm very excited to kind of like seeing what people will build with World Engine. But like I'll pause there.
So the other problem we have besides throughput, right, is user experience. It's garbage to play a game fully on-chain, right? We have a lot of problems that might be solved with account abstraction, but Morris, you've been actively in the weeds building a user interface that your players can enjoy. What are some of the pitfalls you're running into, and how are you trying to get around them?
I mean, right now, if you go onto our game, we're primarily using a browser-based burner wallet, and so it's pretty easy to get going because you don't need to have your own wallet and sign in every transactions. But I think we're building on top of Mud. Mud has an account abstraction. Well, some folks are working on it, and so soon we'll have that adopted as well, which should help with basically not having to sign transactions on everything. Yeah, and then aside from that, I think it's the on-chain aspect of the game is primarily your backend. There's still the front end that you can optimize for, and we've spent a lot of effort in making sure the onboarding experience is smooth, and making sure that the game is still approachable, even because I think right now, even for most on-chain games, even if you are somebody who is crypto native, which could just mean that you have a wallet and you've signed at least one transaction before. A lot of fully on-chain games is still very, very hard to get going, even if you've previously used Uniswap. And so, yeah, just paying a lot of attention to that and making sure that you can really easily onboard onto that. It's something that I've spent a lot of effort on.
Thanks, Morris. Neeraj, what's your biggest pain point around fully on-chain games you wish you could solve, or have someone else solve for you?
I think this user experience thing is really important to talk about, and there's sort of another side of the user experience that, like, besides just how crappy wallets are and, like, is account abstraction really going to solve any problems, which I'm quite skeptical of, actually, is that
Hot take.
I think we're building an RPG, and we thought that, at the end of last year, there was this huge controversy with Wizards of the Coast trying to revoke, like, the open license under which they'd released, like, the game rules. They were getting canceled all over their fan base. We're like, wow, this is like a hot time for us to be releasing a fully decentralized, like, role-playing game setting. All of these guys who are pissed off at Wizards of the Coast are going to be excited to jump on. They get the value of decentralization. They're going to want to play. And so we started pitching it to, like, players and dungeon masters, and like, here's a game world in which you have ownership of, like, what you're building, and it's always going to be open and no one can take it away, and all of this stuff. And we pretty much were met with crickets and tumbleweed, right? The thing is, there's also, I think there's very little understanding sort of outside of the crypto community, and even outside of, like, really diehard people in the crypto community of why decentralization is valuable. And honestly, like, that's what justifies, like, all of the friction in user experience for, like, coming onto these games right now. And it'll take a while, I think, for that kind of, like, understanding to permeate through, like, different player bases. There's some games have player bases that, like, more readily understand the value of decentralization. For example, like, if I were trying to, like, vampire attack, like, the player base of an existing game, I'd be going after the EVE Online community or something like this, because they fundamentally understand the value that fully on-chain games can bring more than the players of other games. And this this component of it is like the biggest problem for us. Like, the top of the funnel is it limits the top of the funnel besides just the user experience of like using MetaMask and stuff like this.
I would argue that targeting folks who have existing crypto knowledge is fine, as opposed to like primarily going after or educating players on why fully on-chain games are cool. Because what I was saying earlier was that I think if you provide an experience that is only possible with fully on-chain games, then the players that want to experience that have no option except to come to you. Whereas if you build a game that is fundamentally similar to something that's in Web 2, but it's on-chain and it's decentralized, now you should come play my game because something about education there. But which I think in that case, then that's a tougher uphill battle, right?
I actually agree with you, and we sort of that entire experience taught us that it is correct to focus on the people who already have a presence, have like a sort of Web3 presence, because it was such a tough sell to bring people who didn't have that presence into the game world.
Yeah. And also, for the folks with crypto knowledge and so on, there's a dearth of consumer applications that's just interesting to have fun with, aside from, I guess, speculating on NFTs or swapping coins for fun. And so I think there's the whole underserved market of just people with crypto assets that just want to do something with it. And might as well just go for that first instead of trying to onboard the next billion people into crypto.
Okay, so let's say with our 25 seconds left, you each get 7 seconds to say what game you would direct people to try as their first fully on-chain game. And this will be embarrassing because there are not a lot of good ones. So go ahead, Scott, and then Morris, then Neeraj.
I would say like Dark Forest Arena is a good snippet.
Can you spin up Dark Forest today and just play it?
Yeah. Like there's Dark Forest Arena.
Dark Forest Arena, yeah. That's what you meant. Yeah, great.
You can try mine, but aside from plugging my own, Words 3 is a pretty good one. I think they're releasing a new one pretty soon.
Words 3. Yeah.
That's on-chain Scrabble.
The only on-chain game that I've had fun playing is Conquest.eth. That's the one that I would direct people to. That's my favorite one so far.
Okay. Thank you guys so much. We're out of time. We got to exit stage right.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.